Have you ever felt like you were born already in debt to your own family? I spent 34 years believing I owed my parents everything simply for existing. The marble floors of my Lakeshore Drive apartment feel cold beneath my bare feet as I pour my morning coffee, steam rising in spirals that remind me of the smoke that used to curl from my mother's cigarettes when she'd deliver her favorite lecture about gratitude. "Quinn, you owe us everything," she'd say, ash falling onto our kitchen table like punctuation marks at the end of each guilt-laden sentence. The Waterford crystal ashtray she used, a wedding gift from my grandmother, would catch the gray flakes while my mother's voice drilled the same message deeper into my consciousness with each repetition. My parents, Richard and Claudia Sterling, perfected the art of emotional taxation long before I understood what manipulation looked like. Growing up in our 3-story stone mansion on the same street where I now live independently, I learned that every birthday gift came with invisible strings. Every college tuition payment was a loan against my future compliance, and every family dinner was an opportunity for them to itemize their sacrifices. The scent of my mother's vanilla candles used to make me feel safe. Now it triggers a Pavlovian response of inadequacy that I've spent years in therapy trying to unpack. Those same diptyque candles that cost $75 each were somehow presented as evidence of their financial sacrifice, as if the luxury was purchased reluctantly for my benefit rather than their own aesthetic preferences. At 34, I've built a successful career as senior marketing director at Whitman and Associates, earning a comfortable $185K annually. Yet my parents still managed to make me feel like that 7-year-old girl who accidentally broke my grandmother's crystal vase. They've weaponized their version of my childhood, creating a mythology where they were perpetual martyrs, sacrificing everything for their ungrateful daughter. According to their carefully crafted narrative, they gave up dream vacations to Tuscany to pay for my piano lessons with Mrs. Rothenberg, postponed their retirement to fund my Northwestern education, and worked extra hours to afford the luxury of raising me in Lincoln Park's most prestigious neighborhood. The reality was different. My father's inheritance from his own father had purchased our house outright in 1991, and my mother's trust fund from her Chicago banking family had covered most of my educational expenses. The truth is more complicated, as truth usually is. My father inherited a substantial insurance business from his own father, and my mother came from old Chicago money, the kind that whispers rather than shouts about its existence, the kind that manifests in understated pearls and memberships at the Union League Club. But they've always preferred the struggling parents' narrative, perhaps because it gave them more leverage over my choices. When I graduated summa cum laude with my marketing degree, they reminded me of the sacrifices. When I landed my first promotion at 26, they calculated how much they'd invested in my success, down to the cost of my childhood orthodontics and SAT prep courses. When I bought this apartment 3 years ago, a bright 2-bedroom with lake views that I'd saved for since my first job, they questioned whether I was becoming too independent for my own good, as if financial autonomy was a character flaw rather than a life goal. The emotional accounting never stopped. Family dinners became quarterly performance reviews where my achievements were reframed as returns on their investment. My promotion to senior director last year was met with calculations about how my Northwestern alumni network had opened doors, as if my work ethic and strategic thinking were irrelevant variables in my success. Even my choice to live alone rather than marry David Westfield, a perfectly suitable investment banker from our social circle, was treated as ingratitude for the excellent husband material they'd introduced me to through their country club connections. Last month, everything I thought I knew about family obligations shifted when my grandmother's lawyer called. Patricia Sterling had been the quiet matriarch of our family, the woman who taught me to bake snickerdoodles in her Lincoln Park kitchen and play chess on Sunday afternoons, who remembered every birthday with handwritten cards that arrived exactly 1 week early, written in fountain pen ink on cream cardstock from Crane & Co. When she passed 3 months ago at 91, I assumed her estate would follow the traditional path, from her to my father, then eventually trickle down to me, wrapped in more conditions and expectations, just like every other financial transaction in our family's carefully orchestrated hierarchy. The morning Mr. Harrison requested my presence at his downtown office, I felt the familiar knot of anxiety tightening in my chest. Chicago's autumn wind whipped against the windows of the 40th floor as I sat across from the silver-haired attorney who had managed my grandmother's affairs for over 2 decades. His mahogany desk held thick folders that seemed to contain more than just legal documents. They held secrets that would reshape everything I believed about my place in the Sterling family hierarchy. The leather-bound portfolios he opened reminded me of the ones my father used for his most important insurance contracts, the kind that represented life-changing money for his clients. "Miss Sterling," he began, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses with the precision of someone who had delivered significant news many times before, "your grandmother left very specific instructions about how her estate should be handled." The leather portfolio he opened contained documents that would prove my parents' emotional manipulation had been built on a foundation of lies, though I didn't know it yet. I simply nodded, expecting to hear about some small keepsake or modest inheritance that would come with the usual family strings attached, never imagining that my grandmother had been planning my liberation for years while I sat in her kitchen, learning to fold pierogi dough and listening to her stories about surviving the Depression with grace and determination. Mr. Harrison's words hung in the air like smoke from my mother's old cigarettes, each syllable weighted with implications that would reshape my entire understanding of family loyalty. "Your grandmother was very concerned about certain family dynamics, Miss Sterling. She spent considerable time ensuring her wishes would be honored precisely as she intended." He slid a cream-colored envelope across the mahogany surface, my name written in my grandmother's familiar script, the same careful penmanship that had adorned birthday cards for 34 years, flowing across Crane & Co.'s stationery, with the deliberate elegance of someone who believed handwriting reflected character. The paper felt heavier than it should have, weighted with implications I couldn't yet comprehend, the grain of expensive cardstock rough beneath my fingertips. "Patricia Sterling left you the entirety of her estate," he continued, his voice gentle but firm, the kind of professional compassion that comes from decades of delivering life-altering news in mahogany-paneled offices. This includes the family trust, investment portfolios, real estate holdings in Chicago and Aspen, and her art collection. The total value is approximately $47 million. The number hit me like a physical force, causing my carefully held composure to crack like thin ice under sudden pressure. My hands began trembling against the leather arms of the chair, and I found myself struggling to process not just the staggering amount, but the fact that my parents had never mentioned I was even included in my grandmother's will. let alone as the primary beneficiary of what amounted to a substantial fortune. The revelation that followed proved even more devastating than the inheritance itself. Mr. Harrison opened a second folder with the methodical precision of a surgeon revealing a malignancy, extracting correspondence between my grandmother and my parents dating back 15 years. Your grandmother became increasingly concerned about your parents' financial demands and their treatment of your relationship with her, he explained, handing me copies of letters that would shatter my understanding of family loyalty forever. In my grandmother's elegant handwriting, the same script that had taught me cursive penmanship during childhood summers, I read her growing alarm at my parents' attempts to control my relationship with her, their subtle suggestions that I was too busy with work for regular visits, and their increasingly bold hints that she should simplify her estate planning to avoid unnecessary complications. One letter, dated just 2 years ago and written on her familiar Tiffany blue stationery, made my stomach clench with recognition. Richard and Claudia have made it clear that they expect Quinn's inheritance to flow through them first, as they put it, for proper financial management. They've suggested this would be more appropriate given their role as her parents and their substantial investment in her upbringing and education. I find their proprietary attitude toward Quinn's future deeply troubling, particularly their assumption that my assets should somehow reimburse them for the costs of child rearing. The letter went on to detail how my parents had gradually limited my access to my grandmother, scheduling their own visits during times they knew I'd be working late on client presentations, and suggesting that my career success meant I no longer needed the emotional support of an elderly relative who might become confused about modern financial planning. Perhaps you've experienced that moment when the tectonic plates of your understanding shift so dramatically that the ground beneath your feet no longer feels stable, when everything you believed about your family's love suddenly reveals itself as an elaborate performance designed to maintain control. Reading my grandmother's private concerns about my parents' manipulation felt like discovering that the childhood I remembered, filled with what I thought were loving sacrifices, was actually an elaborate investment strategy disguised as parental devotion. She had documented their pattern of using guilt and obligation as tools of emotional leverage, noting with increasing alarm how they spoke about my achievements as returns on their investment rather than celebrating my independence and competence. The most damaging evidence came in the form of recorded conversations my grandmother had asked Mr. Harrison to preserve, stored on a small digital device that looked innocuous but contained devastating proof of my parents' calculated manipulation. In my mother's voice, clear and unmistakable through the office speakers, I heard her discussing with clinical detachment how they planned to guide Quinn's inheritance decisions to ensure the money would ultimately benefit what she called the family unit as a whole. She's always been too trusting for her own good, my mother's voice explained to my father, the tone suggesting they were discussing a naive child rather than a successful 34-year-old professional. Patricia's money could set us up for the comfortable retirement we've earned, but Quinn needs to understand that family money should support family goals, not just individual desires. My father's response chilled me to the bone with its cold calculation. Quinn owes us more than she realizes. We've invested everything in creating her success, the private schools, the networking opportunities, the social connections through the club. It's time for some reasonable return on that investment. They weren't talking about love or pride in my accomplishments, They were calculating the financial benefits of their parental investment with the cold precision of venture capitalists discussing a profitable exit strategy, as if my entire existence had been a business plan designed to generate returns. The recordings revealed detailed planning sessions where they discussed moving to their dream retirement community in Naples, Florida, if they could access Patricia's resources through Quinn's natural sense of family obligation. They had already researched properties at Pelican Bay, priced memberships at exclusive golf clubs, and calculated precisely how much of my inheritance they could justify claiming as reasonable reimbursement for 34 years of child-rearing expenses. My entire adult relationship with my parents had been built on a foundation of manipulation that was far more calculated and mercenary than I had ever imagined possible. Sitting in my apartment that evening, surrounded by copies of documents that revealed the calculated nature of my parents' manipulation, I felt something I had never experienced before: the crystalline clarity that comes from seeing truth without the filter of manufactured obligation. The Chicago skyline glittered beyond my floor-to-ceiling windows as I spread my grandmother's letters across my glass dining table, each one a breadcrumb leading me back to memories I had misinterpreted for decades. The vanilla-scented diptyque candle I had lit earlier, the same expensive scent my mother favored for our formal dinners, now seemed like an ironic reminder of how even my comfort preferences had been unconsciously shaped by someone who viewed me as a financial asset rather than a beloved daughter. That moment of recognition changed everything, like switching on lights in a house I'd been navigating in darkness for 34 years. I realized that my grandmother hadn't just left me money. She had left me documentation of a truth I had been too emotionally conditioned to see clearly. Every family gathering where I felt inexplicably guilty despite my achievements, every milestone that was somehow transformed into evidence of my debt to them, every decision they questioned under the guise of parental concern, it had all been part of a systematic pattern designed to keep me emotionally and financially accessible to their demands. If you've ever questioned whether your family's version of love might actually be sophisticated control disguised as care, you're not paranoid to trust that instinct. The next morning, I called my closest friend, Jennifer Martinez, who had known my family since our Northwestern undergraduate days and had often gently suggested that my parents' behavior toward me wasn't typical of healthy family dynamics. Over artisanal coffee at Intelligentsia near my office, the same spot where we dissected countless personal crises over the past decade, I showed her the documents Mr. Harrison had provided. Jennifer's response was immediate and validating, delivered with the kind of unflinching honesty that true friendship requires. "Quinn, I've been waiting 15 years for you to see what everyone else in our circle could see. Your parents have been running a sophisticated long con, and you were always the mark." Her directness, delivered with genuine love that didn't require softening hard truths, gave me the courage to begin planning my response strategically rather than emotionally. Together, we developed what Jennifer called the documentation project, approaching my family history with the same methodical precision I used for client campaigns at Whitman and Associates. I began systematically cataloging every instance of financial manipulation I could remember, creating a detailed timeline that stretched back to my teenage years when they first began teaching me that love required perpetual gratitude payments. The pattern was undeniable once laid out chronologically. Every major life decision had been accompanied by explicit reminders of what I owed them. Every professional success had been reframed as validation of their strategic investment in my potential, and every attempt at authentic independence had been met with emotional manipulation designed to maintain their psychological and financial control over my choices. I photographed the documents Mr. Harrison had given me with obsessive care, storing copies in multiple secure locations, including my safety deposit box at Northern Trust and encrypted cloud storage that even my tech-savvy father couldn't access. I began preparing for the conversation I knew was inevitable, the confrontation that would either liberate me from decades of emotional servitude or confirm my role as their lifetime financial subsidiary. My grandmother's final letter to me, which Mr. Harrison had saved for last like a master storyteller building to his most powerful revelation, provided the roadmap for what came next. In her elegant script, written on her personal stationery, embossed with her Lake Forest address, she had penned what amounted to both a love letter and a battle plan. My dear Quinn, if you are reading this, it means I have given you more than money. I have given you the truth about your parents' intentions and the documentation to protect yourself from their manipulation. Use both wisely. Your parents' love has always been conditional on your compliance and accessibility, but your worth has never been dependent on their approval or their version of family obligation. Build the life that makes you genuinely happy, not the life that makes them financially comfortable. The letter included specific suggestions for managing what she diplomatically called the transition period, recommendations born from decades of watching my parents operate. She advised me to engage my own attorney before revealing the inheritance to my parents, to prepare mentally for their inevitable attempts to guilt me into sharing control of the assets, and to remember that her love for me had never required repayment or performance. Reading her words in the quiet of my apartment, I felt the weight of 34 years of manufactured obligation beginning to lift from my shoulders like morning fog dissipating under strong sunshine. I followed her advice precisely and retained Sarah Chen, an estate attorney Mr. Harrison recommended, who specialized in family financial conflicts and had extensive experience with inheritance manipulation cases. Sarah reviewed all the documentation with the thoroughness of a prosecutor building a case and confirmed what my grandmother had suspected. My parents had been laying sophisticated groundwork for years to access any inheritance I might receive. They had consulted their own lawyers about family financial planning strategies and had developed what Sarah described as a sophisticated emotional manipulation strategy specifically designed to maintain long-term access to your financial resources. The most crucial preparation involved what Sarah termed boundary establishment, legal and emotional fortifications that would protect both my inheritance and my sanity. We drafted clear statements about my intentions for the money, legal documentation that would prevent my parents from claiming any community interest in the assets, and a communication strategy that would allow me to maintain my dignity while protecting my grandmother's final gift. I wasn't preparing for war. I was preparing for the most important conversation of my adult life, the one where I would finally stop apologizing for existing independently and start living as the person my grandmother had always seen in me. The confrontation came exactly as I had anticipated, at Sunday dinner in their formal dining room, the same space where they had delivered decades of guilt-laden lectures about gratitude and obligation. The sterling silver gleamed under the chandelier light as my mother served pot roast with the theatrical precision of someone who viewed cooking as evidence of maternal sacrifice. "Quinn, darling," she began, her voice dripping with the false sweetness that had always preceded her most manipulative conversations. Your father and I have been thinking about our retirement plans, and we wanted to discuss how the family finances might work together. My father, cutting his meat with surgical precision, added without looking up, "Your grandmother's passing has reminded us that family wealth should benefit the family unit. We've made significant sacrifices for your success, and now it's time to think about how we can all benefit from the foundation we've built together." The casual way he assumed ownership of my inheritance, wealth he didn't even know I had received, revealed the depth of their entitlement. They had already planned my financial future without consulting me, viewing my inheritance as community property simply because they had raised me. This was the moment I had been preparing for, the conversation that would either liberate me or cement my role as their lifetime financial subsidiary. I set down my fork and reached for the folder I had brought, watching their expressions shift from confident expectation to confusion as I spread the documents across their antique table. "Actually," I said, my voice steadier than I felt, "I think we need to discuss what Grandma Patricia really thought about family obligation." The transformation on their faces as I read portions of my grandmother's letters was like watching a carefully constructed facade crumble in real time. My mother's confident smile faltered as I quoted her own recorded words back to her. "Quinn owes us more than she realizes. We've invested everything in creating her success, and it's time for some return on that investment." The color drained from my father's face as he recognized his own voice, discussing how they could access Patricia's resources through Quinn to fund their early retirement in Florida. "Where did you get these?" my mother demanded, her mask of maternal concern slipping completely. "Patricia had no right to record private family conversations. This is a violation of trust." The irony of her accusing my grandmother of violating trust while she had been secretly plotting to control my inheritance was not lost on me. My father's response was more calculating. "Quinn, you have to understand, we were only thinking about the family's long-term financial security. Everything we've done has been for your benefit." I had anticipated their denials and deflections, but I hadn't been prepared for the raw desperation that followed. When I explained that my grandmother had left her entire $47 million estate directly to me, with specific legal provisions preventing them from claiming any portion, their carefully maintained composure shattered completely. My mother began crying, not the gentle tears of disappointment, but the harsh sobs of someone whose life plan had just evaporated. My father's reaction was colder but more revealing. He immediately began calculating what he called reasonable reimbursement for child-rearing expenses. "You owe us everything," my mother repeated through her tears, but this time the words felt hollow rather than devastating. "We gave up our dreams, our retirement savings, our comfortable life to raise you. This money should honor those sacrifices." So no, but I had heard those exact words on the recordings my grandmother had preserved, delivered with clinical calculation rather than emotional pain. The performance felt rehearsed because they had been practicing these arguments for years, preparing for the moment when they would claim ownership of my future. The final revelation came when my father produced documents they had already prepared: power of attorney papers, financial planning proposals, and investment strategies for our family inheritance. They had been so confident in their ability to manipulate me that they had consulted attorneys and financial advisors before even confirming I had inherited anything. Their presumption was breathtaking. They had planned the distribution of my grandmother's wealth while she was still alive, treating my inheritance as their retirement fund. But the most devastating moment came when I asked them directly, "When were you planning to tell me about your retirement plans in Florida?" The silence that followed confirmed what my grandmother had suspected. They had never intended to include me in their decision-making process. I was simply the vehicle through which they would access the resources they felt they deserved, a financial instrument disguised as a daughter. 5 years later, I'm writing this from the sunroom of the lakefront house I purchased with my inheritance. Not the ostentatious mansion my parents would have chosen, but a warm, inviting home where the morning light streams through windows that have never witnessed manipulation disguised as love. The transition from their version of family to my chosen reality wasn't immediate or painless, but it was absolutely necessary. The vanilla candles I once associated with my mother's guilt lectures now remind me of my grandmother's kitchen, where love was given freely without the expectation of repayment. My parents initially attempted what Sarah Chen had predicted, a campaign of emotional terrorism designed to guilt me into sharing the inheritance. They enlisted extended family members, family friends, and even their pastor in efforts to convince me that withholding family money from them was both selfish and unnatural. For months, my phone rang constantly with relatives who had been fed carefully crafted stories about my sudden greed and abandonment of family values. But my grandmother's documentation proved invaluable. When pressed for specifics, none of these well-meaning intermediaries could explain why my inheritance should belong to anyone other than the person who had been specifically chosen to receive it. The most revealing moment came when my father hired an attorney to challenge the will, claiming my grandmother had been manipulated into disinheriting them. The legal proceedings lasted 8 months before their lawyer advised them to drop the case. Mr. Harrison's meticulous documentation of my grandmother's mental acuity, combined with years of correspondence detailing her concerns about their behavior, made their claims impossible to substantiate. More damaging was the discovery process, which revealed the extent of their preparation to access my inheritance, preparations that predated my grandmother's death by years. It took nearly 2 years for exhaustion to replace their anger. My parents eventually realized that their decades-long investment in emotional manipulation had yielded no returns, and they gradually shifted their focus toward rebuilding their own financial future. I learned through extended family that they had indeed moved to Florida, funding their retirement through the sale of the family home and my father's business. They live comfortably in a modest retirement community near Tampa, though not with the luxury they had anticipated from my inheritance. We exchange holiday cards now, brief and polite communications that acknowledge our shared history, without pretending our relationship was ever based on unconditional love. The freedom that comes from stepping out of a lifetime of manufactured obligation is difficult to describe to someone who has never experienced it. I wake up each morning in my beautiful home, surrounded by artwork I chose because it brings me joy, rather than because it impresses others, and I feel the profound peace that comes from living authentically. My career has flourished without the constant background noise of parental expectations. I was recently promoted to vice president at Whitman and Associates, a success that belongs entirely to me rather than being framed as validation of someone else's investment. I've used my grandmother's gift in ways that would make her proud. Beyond securing my own future, I've established a scholarship fund for first-generation college students, who need both financial support and mentorship to navigate higher education without family guidance. The Patricia Sterling Foundation has grown significantly over these 5 years. We've now helped 47 young people pursue degrees in fields their families didn't understand or support, and 3 of our early recipients have graduated and begun their own careers. There's something profoundly healing about helping others break free from the limitations imposed by well-meaning but controlling families. Perhaps most importantly, I've learned to recognize the difference between love and ownership, between family loyalty and financial obligation. The relationships I've built over these 5 years since stepping away from my parents' manipulation are based on mutual respect and genuine affection rather than calculated exchanges of resources for compliance. Jennifer remains my closest friend, my support system, and living proof that chosen family can be more nurturing than biological ties bound by guilt and expectation. I've also found love with Marcus, a professor at Northwestern who values my independence as much as my companionship. Our relationship thrives precisely because neither of us views the other as a project to be managed or an investment to be optimized. When people ask if I miss my parents, I tell them the truth. I miss the parents I thought I had, but I don't miss the anxiety and self-doubt that came with being treated as a lifetime debtor rather than a beloved daughter. What question will you finally ask yourself when you stop performing gratitude for people who view your love as payment rather than gift? Your worth was never determined by how well you could serve others' expectations, and your life becomes exponentially richer the moment you start living that truth.